Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Kenny. I'm the director of Glucksman Ireland House at NYU. We're delighted to welcome everyone to today's special and much anticipated event as we launch Niall Whelehan's book, Changing Land, Diaspora, Activism and the Irish Land War. This is the third volume in our new Glucksman Irish Diaspora series. Niall Whelehan is Professor of History at Strathclyde University in Scotland. He completed his doctorate at the European University Institute in Florence. And before coming to Strathclyde, he worked at Bielefeld University in Germany, at NYU Galway, and at the University of Edinburgh. He teaches the history of modern Ireland at undergraduate and postgraduate levels and runs a year-long undergraduate module on the global history of terrorism. He's also interested in history and film and organizes the series Screening Irish History at the Glasgow Film Theatre, CCA Glasgow, and Edinburgh's Film House. So Professor Whelehan's work focuses on the history of migration, political violence, nationalism, and radicalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. His first book, The Dynamiters, is really the definitive history of the field, Irish nationalism and political violence in the wider world in the late 19th century, published by Cambridge in 2012. His second book, which we're celebrating today, is Changing Land, Diaspora, Activism and the Irish Land War, which examines radical networks in Ireland and in Irish migrant communities in Scotland, England, the United States, and Argentina. Professor Whelehan accomplishes this formidable task with a really deft narrative touch. The way he does it is to focus on the life story of a relatively unknown individual activist in the context of intricate, complex networks of diasporic communication and exchange. So Niall, we're delighted to welcome you back to Ireland House today. Equally delighted to welcome Professor Joe Gouldy to Ireland House for the first time. Professor Gouldy is Associate Professor of History and Associate Professor of Data Science at Southern Methodist University, where she teaches British history, the history of capitalism, and a variety of highly innovative digital history courses based on a lab style approach that she has pioneered. To the best of my understanding, this is a matter of applying machine learning to issues of political history, social and cultural history, to a wide variety of texts with the focus on inequality, perhaps as the central theme. Professor Gouldy received her AB in literature from Harvard College, studied at Trinity College, Cambridge, and completed her PhD in history at University of California, Berkeley. She was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, postdoctoral fellow in digital history at the University of Chicago, assistant professor at Brown. Publications too many to mention, but I'll mention a few. First book, Roads to Power, is a history of the invention of the infrastructure of transportation and of the state, really, in Britain, and published by Harvard in 2012. Same year, she released Paper Machines, an open source toolkit to help students understand and enjoy distant reading technologies. She's the co-author with David Armitage of the History Manifesto, published by Cambridge in 2014, which looks at the effects of digital analysis on historical inquiry, on periodization, on graduate student training, and on the wider reading public for history. Another book, The Dangerous Art of Text Mining, is under contract. And then a very significant major new work of historical interpretation coming out with Yale University Press in June. And I think Caroline is popping the links in chat for us. This book is called The Long Land War, The Global Struggle for Occupancy Rights, The Global Struggle for Occupancy Rights. As I understand it, tells the story of struggles over land and water, and equality initiated by some of the land reform movements that we're dealing with today in Ireland, also in Scotland, and extending that story through to the present in ways that really might give us fertile grounds for conversation today. So I've said a lot because I had a lot to say. Welcome, Niall and Joe. The format today, we're going to have a conversation about the book. Joe Goldie is going to interview Niall about the major themes in the book. We'll let that run 20 to 30 minutes. We'll then open it up, as we love to do, to the audience, Q&A format. I'm going to invite you to put your questions in chat. Feel free to put questions and comments in chat the whole way through. You don't have to wait until the end. I will pose the questions back to our two panelists. I think it's the best way to do it. But we love to run this in meeting format and keep it interactive so we can see you, and feel free, during the Q&A especially, to put on the video portion, and we'll get this underway. Have I forgotten anything? I doubt it. I think I covered a lot. So over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Kevin. It's such an honor to be here with you and with Niall and with the rest of the community here to talk about what's really a terrific book, which is ready for the classroom, appropriately priced, a beautiful volume. Mine is already heavily dog-eared, as you can see. And many of the audience members, I recognize their names from the beautiful bibliography, which is, it is a terrific survey of the field as well as intervention in our growing appreciation for an international role of Irish diaspora and world history. So I'd like to invite Niall to start us off by talking about some of the terms that he puts into play in the introduction of the book. In the introduction of the book, we learned that the reason to look at this Irish global diaspora is that there is an international working class that is contributing new forms to intellectual history. Now, intellectual history, working class, migration studies, these are not typically terms that co-occur in the same book. Niall, could you tell us a little bit about your approach?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Joe. And first of all, just to say thanks to Ireland House for generously organising and hosting this event, and honoured to be here with Joe and Kevin discussing the book. And thanks to everyone for coming along. So an international sort of Irish working class, so the 1880s, the time of the Irish Land War, is what we might call the peak of the Irish diaspora. We're approaching the peak of the Irish diaspora when about 3 million Irish-born immigrants exist, and the population of Ireland itself is about 5 million. So you have about 40% of all the people born in Ireland are living somewhere else. And how they sort of interact with Ireland, relate back to Ireland, is fascinating. And the Land War is a sort of period of a sort of political and social, intense political and social activism, gives a good window on the different ways immigrants sort of engage with Ireland, but also allows us to understand, I guess, migration is this very multifaceted thing, rather than being a sort of singular story of just the sender country and the country of arrival. And of course, most of these migrants are working class. Sort of internationalism, cosmopolitan, or maybe terms that we would more associate with the middle classes or with elites, professionals, maybe in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And that's also the case. I mean, some of the leaders of the Land League movement are professionals, but mobility wasn't confined to the sort of leadership figures of the middle classes. It was also an aspect of working class life. Irish immigrants were familiar with sort of issues of inequality in rural Ireland, high rents, evictions, and so on, and also in urban centres in the United States and in Britain. And in communications between them, create this sort of transnational movement that also sort of spreads out into other movements for social and political reform in sort of immigrant and diaspora centres, to sort of lead to this very broad movement with sort of universalist goals. So I don't know if that's a sort of roundabout way of answering your question, Joe, but I think the sheer scale of the diaspora in the late 19th century, the sort of universal dimensions of the issues at stake, so secure housing, stopping evictions and lowering rents, or at least having security, against your rent increasing every year resonated, you know, in multiple locations.
Okay. I'm looking at your beautiful and lengthy list of archival and manuscript sources. This book took you all over the place. You went to archives in Boston and Dublin and across Scotland and the UK. And then there's an even lengthier, you know, positively bewildering list of newspapers that you consulted in order to assemble what's, you know, what the essential form of this story you're telling is a group biography. So your characters, you're able to follow these characters who cross oceans, who go from Ireland to Argentina, carrying their politics with them into new and interesting formats, who intersect with anti-rent movements in upstate New York and with Chartism in England, and the legacy of the Chartists with Henry George. So this wonderful swirl of people and ideas. And just for those of you who do not yet have a copy of the book, let me just read some of the newspapers consulted to give you a flavor of this undertaking. The Belfast Morning News, the Boston Globe, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the Buenos Aires Herald, Chicago Tribune, Cork Constitution, all of these Irish papers, but also the Libre Pensador in Buenos Aires, the Nación in Buenos Aires, the New York Times, Herald, and Evening Express. Now, in this book, you quote Laura Putnam's article, The Transnational and the Text Searchable, in a short reflection on how new forms of technology and digital archives are making possible a new global reach of history. And your book looks to me like a perfect embodiment of this. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the process you went through, how you were attracted to these archives and what they allowed you, the kinds of arguments and portraits they allowed you to make that might not have been possible for historians working 10 or 20 years before?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think obviously we probably think about these things a little bit differently now as well after COVID and all the sort of archival shutdowns and restrictions on travel that we've had. So this type of study wouldn't have been possible maybe 10 or 15 years ago, just because I use digitized newspapers, you know, a lot. And of course, those newspapers are available in different ways, the Irish ones, but in terms of looking at the people that the book is essentially about, they are, you know, as I call them, forgotten figures or people that have been overlooked. Of course, there's a reason why previous generations of scholars overlooked them. It's very hard to find them. You know, they're sort of needle in a haystack names unless you know where to look. And of course, through digitized searching, you can find these people a lot easier. But even if you can't find them through digital search engines, I mean, search engines are not perfect. You know, you don't always find what you want, even sometimes when you know it's there. Things like shipping records, you know, let me know that someone like John Craig was in a particular location at a particular time, or Marguerite Moore, and then I could go and, you know, rinse out the newspapers to try and find out what they were up to there, or if I could get any information about them. So digitization has been immensely helpful, while, you know, always trying to bear in mind that, you know, you don't want to fall into the trap that Laura Putnam calls drive-by transnationalism, you know, so just bringing together all of sort of superficial searching in some contexts and bringing a lot of material together without enough sensitivity to local contexts. So I tried to sort of combine digitized newspapers and research in digital archives with local archives. And, you know, some of the best discoveries come through conversations with archivists and say, okay, well, this material is here, maybe that might be interesting for your study. And then you find that it is, you know, and just limits in that also, not all newspapers are digitized. And of course, the main newspaper, the main newspaper for me was the Irish World. Of course, the Irish World for these years in the 1880s and the late 1870s is not digitized. And so that was a sort of obstacle. So I go through, well, not necessarily an obstacle. I mean, you go through the old microfilm reels and the hard copy, but I'm sure it will be digitized soon, and I'll be jealous of future generations of scholars, if not resentful, who have access to digitized Irish World. So, and I guess maybe also just to say a final comment on that, I think maybe there's a lot to be said for just going to archives and immersing yourself in an archive and, you know, not having other distractions. I think if you're working in digital archives, maybe you do it before teaching, or you're in your office, or you're answering emails, and you're still sort of absorbed in work. Whereas in an archive, maybe you're just isolated from that, and you have more time to think, and maybe some of the sort of turning points, maybe in my research, or turning what was a project into a book, came, I would say, more in physical archives than in online archives.
Terrific. It's so interesting to hear you talk through this and talk through the dynamics of how these ideas are changing. We theorized in 2014 in the History Manifesto that digitalized archives might indeed shift us towards a more international, but also more long-term point of view. And I was based on the title, when I started reading, I thought, well, this is a beautiful book that has gone international. But I was surprised as I read to find that this approach of international biography also allowed you to go temporal in a certain sense. So your characters' lives intersect with the period of Chartism, the period of Young Ireland, the building of the Irish newspaper network, and then of course with the Long Land War. And then some of them are incredibly old-lived. They last until the period of Irish independence. And so these stories keep on going and going. And there's a sense of connecting the postcards that we have received from moments in Irish history past, and moments of grassroots radicalism now connected to the era of an international Henry George. And I find this to be a great intervention in what has already over the last decade become a trend towards studies of global Irish diaspora. Your first book, of course, participated in that. And of course, Sean McMahon, who's on the call, and Tara McCarthy and Eli Janis have contributed wonderful volumes about international Irish diaspora. Can you tell us a little about how and why you ended up taking on longer periods of time and connecting lives, what that does to our narrative, our sense of Irish history?
Yeah, I guess I followed the people and they pulled me in those directions. And I mean, I guess the question is, well, how did you find these people in the first place? And they all corresponded with Henry George. So Henry George's correspondence, which is archived in the New York Public Library, sort of made all these, sort of linked all these disparate people. So somebody in Dundee, somebody in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, or someone in Ireland, in New York. And then following these people brings you across these interesting places and interesting periods. And I mean, and you're right, they stretch across a long period. And Marguerite Moore seems to live forever almost. She's active in the late 1870s and still in the 1920s. I think just that stretch of period, and of course Thomas Dever is one of the characters in the book. His activism starts in the 1830s. I think it shows the resilience of ideas of land reform and how significant they are, and that they don't go away. They're not a fringe or a faddy thing that happen, on the margins of otherwise important history, or maybe some of the ideologies and movements we're more familiar with in terms of nationalism or socialism and so on. But that these people are there all the time, and some form of collective land ownership and ideas of nationalisation, are not new in any of these periods, whether during the Chartist era or during the Irish Land War or later on in the early 20th century. They have a longevity, and they're not fringe, and some, maybe they're not always, maybe their advocates don't always have the upper hand, but they're not necessarily fringe ideas. The group biography, so it's helpful in that it brings you into these different interesting places. And I guess in a sense, I'm a reluctant biographer in some ways. So when I was doing my PhD, I never really thought I would be a biographer. But I guess teaching some of this history, you realize in teaching it through a set of individual lives or people, it helps make more sense of it, or it makes it more of a story. And I think the same in writing. Where in this book, I try to write the story and use lives to try and elaborate the history. Because once you don't, I guess in global transnational history, once we don't have the sort of nation state as a sort of box to put things in, it can get messy. So group biography is also a way to, I guess, kind of organize material as well.
Thank you, thank you. I think your intervention in the history of land politics is extremely helpful for those of us who are curious about long-term stories of radicalism and claims of universal morality. You locate your story firmly in circles of Irish diaspora where folks like Dr. Craig and Marianne Moore are contributing their own message about their own version of land history based in Irish kind of experience. And it's clearly not Marxist. It sometimes connects. I think in chapter 4, we find out that Peter Kropotkin is interested in Irish affairs. In a later chapter, some of your characters intersect with the Magone brothers who participate in the Mexican Revolution and even with Malatesta, so Irish anarchism is there. Can you tell us a little bit more about how tracing Irish diaspora helps to connect these local leftist forms of radicalism in a way that doesn't show up if we just study the Marxist International?
Yeah, so I think focusing, let's say, on Marxism or an ideology can work, but it also partitions you off maybe from looking at relationships, networks that go across either ideological boundaries or geographical boundaries. And again, coming back to people, looking at people allows you to see how, you know, different ideologies were combined, you know, ideological differences were tolerated, you know, broadly in leftist groups. And I guess I sort of followed the historian Ilham Khoury Makdisi in this, in her work on global radicalism in the late 19th century, how people at the time sort of don't follow hard and fast distinctions, ideological distinctions, you know, and will happily tolerate, you know, minor distinctions in sort of broad leftist movements. So, for example, in this story, nationalization is supported by all the figures in the book, but also they use it in different senses, and you know, it's often means something different to them. But that's sort of an aspect of this sort of activism or the activist worlds that they inhabit. Exchanges between people, and you mentioned Peter Kropotkin there and Malatesta. You know, sometimes I guess we think about transnational exchange in terms of only in terms of ideology, in terms of intellectual history, but there's also a very pragmatic aspect to it as well. And so, for example, when Dr. Craig met Perico Malatesta in Argentina, Malatesta was interested in him because he wanted to learn about his tactics and the strategies of the land war and boycotting in particular, and what he saw as being very successful and how he might incorporate them into his own sort of movement. And I imagine I would speculate it's the same with Magone brothers. I haven't read enough about, or I haven't discovered in the archives enough about their sort of conversations with Craig and what they thought about Ireland and the Irish Land War, what he told them about it. But again, with Kropotkin, comes to Ireland as a sort of international anarchist of renown, but people are interested in him as an ex-political prisoner and what he has to say about political prisoners, and he's interested in Michael Davitt as a former political prisoner. So around their sort of ideological affinities or sort of social and activist affinities, there is also, you know, these other concerns that sort of bring people together. And sometimes taking a sort of rigidly maybe ideological approach to the book sort of cuts off or partitions off maybe some of those connections, if that sort of makes sense.
Very good. One of the complications of international land politics that your story brushes up against happens when the story takes us in chapter 4 to Argentina. And we follow Dr. Craig through a variety of different kinds of things that happen when the Irish arrive in a different part of the New World. So some of them carry a message of radical land politics with them, but some of them are interested in settler colonialism. They're interested in taking cheap land however they can, wherever it's available, with no concern for indigenous land rights. And they become some of the settlers and some of the millionaire ranchers of Argentina, which creates complications. Can you tell us about some more? I appreciate that the real delicate touch with which you follow this. You're not hammering home this universal message of universal land rights without questions about how it falls into complication in different places. Can you maybe treat us to a story or two from that chapter?
Yeah, of course. So the land war, when it takes off, is supported in Argentina, and particularly the sort of humanitarian aspect of it, so the land relief funds. But some of the people leading those relief funds and donating to them are also benefiting from land speculation in lands that have been recently enclosed through, extremely violent campaign of displacement and extermination in the plains in Argentina to remove indigenous inhabitants. So one second-generation Irish immigrant called Eduardo Casey makes a huge, immense fortune in the early 1880s through speculating in this land and selling it in small parcels onto other, well, he wants to sell it onto other Irish immigrants or people of Irish descent. Just to give you a sense of how big his land holdings were, just one of his estates, not counting the other ones, but one of his estates was bigger than County Westmeath, the entire land area of County Westmeath that his parents had emigrated from in the 1830s. So huge. So he engaged in this while at the same time, supporting anti-landlordism in Ireland. So there's a remarkable lack of reflection on the sort of issues and obvious limits to that universalism then in someone like Eduardo Casey. But at the same time, John Craig, the sort of land league activist in Argentina, is at least to some extent aware of these issues and raises some of these letters to Henry George. In another sense, there's a trade unionist called Peter O'Leary, who's sort of takes it upon himself as a mission just to try and unite the Irish diaspora, so he goes and lectures about the Irish in Britain and the United States, and he lectures about the Irish in America and Britain. He sees assisted emigration as a cure for sort of labourers' plight in Ireland, and his activism, I should say, is very much focused on Irish labourers and improving their condition, and part of that he sees as emigration. And part of that is emigration to the Red River Valley region. And he says very derogatory things about the indigenous communities in the Red River Valley and Ojibwe communities that he encounters on his tours there. And again, there's a sort of lack of reflection on this on his behalf, but also, I guess, it's a sort of Eurocentrism and to his thinking on these issues. And of course, the Land League emerges in the shadow of an empire, and in O'Leary's case and some others, there's aspects of colonial thinking, sort of repackaged colonial thinking as well, and how they see the future of Irish immigrants in some lands that have been, from which indigenous people have been recently displaced. So attitudes towards land and migration are contradictory, and individuals sort of bring up these contradictions sometimes.
Very good. I confess that my brain is jogging and was racing as I was reading this section on settler colonialism, and that sensitivity of yours to the contradictions of what happens when Ireland for the Irish becomes Argentina, and the Red River Valley also for the Irish. My most recent book is about 20th century land politics, and it's called The Long Land War because I think much of 20th century land politics was read against the revolution in Ireland and the invention of land reform and rent control there. And I can prove that a lot of people working at the United Nations in the 1940s and 1950s also thought that Ireland was formative and Irish land issues were formative. This issue that you have so nicely centered on and that you explore so well, of what's settler colonialism versus tenant right. What are those two poles of modern land politics? It remains a difficult issue for those involved in agrarian reform through the 20th century. And I am hopeful that we'll have more opportunities to continue talking about it. But maybe this will be my last question before we go on to some questions from the audience. We have a few in the chat already. Let me encourage anybody else to add theirs to the chat. And I think Kevin will pick things up after I'm done. But let me close in asking Niall, can you tell us about, do you have any other projects on the stove that are cooking away that we might get to learn about sometime soon?
Okay, thanks, Joe. And just to say, I'm fascinated to hear more about your project on the Long Land War and some of these how some of these debates resurface in the 20th century, you know, and in different contexts. And so really looking forward to reading more about that. In terms of my new projects, as maybe you've guessed, in writing this, I became more and more interested in Argentina and I guess a different Irish Atlantic world, the Southern Atlantic. So I'm looking at some Irish families who were in Argentina, who were around at the time of both the land war and secular colonialism, but also in previous generations had a presence in the Caribbean, and in the late 18th century would engage in trade, you know, with plantations in the Caribbean. So developing that, John Craig, this character in Changing Land, appears in that a bit more as well, as does his family and ancestors. So looking forward to starting that.
Thank you both so much. I see questions popping up in chat. I think actually I'm going to depart from script where I said I would ask the questions. I'm going to call on people, and if you with questions from Cian McMahon, Andrew Feimster, and Catherine Shannon, and so please pose the questions in chat, and then I will call on you to activate your video and audio. Before doing that, I'll exert executive privilege and ask one question of my own, and this is for both Niall and Joe. So in the book, there's a towering figure, and that's Henry George. He's determinative in the lives of your protagonists, and he also provides the narrative glue in a way for the book, because the book is arranged, 4 of the chapters focus on an individual, the chapter in Scotland on a group of women in Dundee, but everybody has a connection to Henry George. Henry George, an American land reformer who's a big figure in Irish politics and the politics of land as well. He's very hard to understand. People found him hard to understand at the time, and people who read him today find him hard to understand, in part because he was involved in so many things and his position changed over time. So land nationalization isn't the same as a single tax, and of course he had a view on Chinese exclusion that we know about. So, you know, so thinking about this walking in this morning, it occurred to me that maybe Henry George is the Thomas Piketty of the 1870s, in that everybody bought the book and claimed to have read it, but I don't know if everybody really read the book and understood it. And that's certainly true in my case. I did read Piketty. Did I understand it? I make no claim to understanding all of it. So I wonder if each of you could maybe have a stab at telling us about George's historical significance and perhaps the relevance of his ideas to the present, to the post-history.
Well, I would say to Kevin, I've joined the club and not completely understanding Henry George's position and everything as well. He's a very elusive figure. I think in this context for the Irish Land War, his huge value is how much he brought a spotlight to Ireland. You know, his very presence in Ireland brought all of this international attention on the Land War and the Land League and the Ladies' Land League, but also his connections in different places. And his correspondence is full of these really rich connections, people writing to him, and you know, he responded. He was a good correspondent. So again, it brings lots of attention. People come out of interest in him as well as an interest in the Land War and come. It was fortuitous that his defining work, Progress and Poverty, came out at the start of the Land War. So there's an interesting confluence there. Of course, his wife was, I think, 2nd or 3rd generation Irish as well, or Irish Australian. His attitudes changed, as you mentioned. So in terms of during the Land War in the early 1880s, he seemed committed to nationalization. That changes over time in the early 1880s. And of course, by the end of the 1880s, after the Haymarket Affair and sort of anti-radical scare in the US, increasingly sort of distances himself from socialism and from the left more. But I think at the time of the Land War, and to try and explore in the book, is that he sort of enjoyed this ambiguity, or it was the ambiguity around his attitudes to nationalization and relationship to Marx and relationship to socialism was something that he tolerated and others tolerated or even embraced, because it sort of gave him a much broader spectrum of followers. And of course, Marx wasn't impressed with him at all. But I think George, allowed these sort of ambiguities to persist at least until the mid 1880s, because it gave him made his movement into a much broader church. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I really appreciated the way Niall took on Henry George, who is, I think, largely because of the influence of Irish historians re-emerging as a central international figure. And I say Irish historians because there is, you can read in the 1970s and 1980s an attempt by British historians to put George's name in parentheses next to Heinemann and the Duke of Argyll, and to cover all of the people who debated Henry George, and to maybe try to push him off to the side. But then again, we've had more British studies on the history of land reform in Britain itself, thanks to Paul Redman et al. And so George is, again in play. And again, in America, American historians have liked to treat George as the definition of the marginal, a failed candidate for mayor of New York City. But Irish and Scottish historians aware of George's speaking tours have pointed out, and I think rightly so, that it's George who is able to articulate an international motive for land nationalization that makes a lot of the work of the land reform conceivable, and helps to win converts in Scotland. And of course, that is the Scottish story of land reform is a longue durée story. It is not over yet. So I picked up George on the other side in the 20th century, where his influence is still potent in the 1940s and 1950s. People are unafraid to use him, to quote him in academic papers. And there are these longue durée histories being written in the 1940s and 1950s. Niall quotes one of them, Anna DeMille, the daughter of the director, I believe, who is tracing the international influence of the ideas of Henry George on urban policy and taxation in Australia and in Southeast Asia and across North American cities. And it's clear from those older longue durée histories that George's influence is wide and broad, even though he is dismissed from the academy. For my purposes, I think George is the great popularizer of Mill. I think of George as the person who really spells out the idea of the unearned increment of landlord wealth as being at the heart of what is problematic about modern capitalism. And I'm someone who identifies as a historian of technology. Whenever the historians of technology will have me, I've written about infrastructure. I think one of the things that's so powerful about that line of thinking from Mill and Spencer and George is the idea that land should be treated as an infrastructure, as a commons. And if land is treated like a commons and it isn't allowed to appreciate it as an asset class that investors can simply buy up to monopolize, if it is treated like an asset class that's an infrastructure that we should all have access to, then capitalism you can imagine a form of capitalism where a rising tide really does float all boats, and the promises of Adam Smith then become true. So there's this fight. It's not the Marxist fight. It's a fight for a livable form of capitalism. And I think those were ideas that were clearly compelling in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And I believe they're becoming more and more relevant today. Niall and I were earlier talking about the work of a UN special rapporteur named Leilani Farha, who has made some wonderful documentaries about international land politics and private assets monopolizing real estate and what that's doing to housing markets in North and South America today and across Europe. So these ideas are still relevant, and I think we historians need to do a little bit of catching up. I pasted into the chat a link to one of my articles on the longue durée event.
Thank you. So we have a question from Cian McMahon along the lines of what one might miss in the digital archive and find in the traditional archive. Cian, would you like to pose that question yourself? Perhaps not.
Kevin, no, sorry, Kevin.
Oh, there you
Hi,
are.
I'm here. Excuse
Yeah,
me.
good. Go ahead.
Hi,
Keith.
everyone. I'm sorry. I'll let the little video come on there so you can see. Oh, yes, not much better. Sorry. No, thanks very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to digging into this book. Niall, as somebody who has spent a lot of time on the on the microfilm myself, and the ups and downs of working with it, and who's also tried to make sense of what are the boundaries of working with digitized newspapers. It's tempting, but it also, as you said, comes. I just was wondering, are there some aspects of the book that maybe you kind of weren't expecting, but that you had to kind of find almost by accident while working through hard copy or microfilm? I don't know, any ideas about that? And thanks very much. This has been great.
Okay, thanks, Cian. So accidental discoveries in archives. I guess, yeah, so the chapter on Argentina, it was an accidental. I was going through Henry George's correspondence expecting to find something else, and I found these letters from John Craig, who I knew as a sort of Irish anarchist in Argentina, and then realized that he had been writing to Henry George in the 1880s, and realized he was a Landleaguer. And so, you know, this was an important sort of discovery, certainly in terms of the book itself. The same with Marguerite Moore. Again, discovered her connections with Henry George. In Dundee, for example, working in archives there, archivists sort of directed me towards, you know, these really rich collections about, you know, the health outcomes for Irish workers in jute factories, you know, and how they fared, and hospitalization rates and accident rates and all these kind of things that, you know, I wouldn't have known if I hadn't gone there and spoken to the archivist. So yeah, I mean, happy to say archives were full of productive accidental discoveries, but like all of us, you know, there were days in the archives, of course, where you wonder if you're making any progress too.
So we have a question from Andrew Femister, which I think is relevant for both of our panelists. And this, I think, has to do with whether the land war is an end or a beginning, or both.
Yeah, but hi Niall. Hi Niall, good to see you. Hi. Yeah, that's essentially it. I'm just wondering about how you see the 1880s as a transformative period with George and the land war, because obviously land nationalisation and demands for land reform, you know, stretch well into the 20th century and beyond. But to what extent do things change there? Because I'm thinking about how land nationalisation in particular is seen as not a progressive reform, but actually a retrogressive one, as an archaic one belonging to like an older form of civilization. So if you could speak to that, would be great. Yeah,
so I mean, well, I can speak to that in different ways. I guess one person in the book is Thomas Ainge Dever, who is a sort of old school, let's say, land reformer. And when he attends meetings of socialists at the First International in New York, you know, he writes about his shock at some of the proposals that he heard, and how, you know, nationalization, not just of land, but also the means of production, seemed, you know, so strange to him. And it really, there seemed to be a huge generational divide or an end of a particular form of land reform, sort of in that story that he was telling about his interactions with the First International in New York. But at the same time, I think fundamentally what the land leaguers, land nationalisers among them shared with George, and I mean, I think all of the Land League and other movements, was a sort of moral idea about land reform, and that the right to land comes from occupancy, or as George would have argued, it's a birthright, but you have a moral. And I guess coming back to what Joe mentioned earlier, the unearned increment, rent and money made from land just through its appreciation and value, you know, and that's not the product of any work or of any labor, is immoral. And only the people who work the land have a right to that land, or the people who live on it have a right, and have a right to that profit that's made on the sort of true rates of appreciation. And I think that was at the core in the Land League, and I don't think that comes to an end. I think that stretches on into the 20th century. But of course, nationalisation itself goes through different nuances. But I think the moral dimensions. And George always emphasized, that he saw economic law and moral law as one, that there is a sort of longer durée sort of continuity there. And of course, the land war is an episode where a lot sort of changes. And of course, the legislation that comes out of the Irish land war is important in attitudes, later attitudes towards land reform, as Joe was mentioning earlier. But certainly, I wouldn't, just changes, but I wouldn't necessarily say the end.
Yeah.
I won't give away too much, but as the title of my book out May 3rd explains, I think the era of the long land war doesn't end until 1974. The Irish Land Acts of 1881 and 1886 become in a certain way the pattern for all post-colonial land reforms in Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, and indigenous land movements in most of those places. The idea of occupancy, which is formulated with Henry George on small farmers, giving small farmers occupancy, reversing the sins of colonialism by giving the land back to the people from whom it was stolen. And that's it's a set of ideas that shows up first and most clearly in Ireland. And so the work of this Irish diaspora is incredibly important. And I'll just say that I think Andrew has been incredibly restrained by not telling us all. So I will advertise that he has coming out from Cambridge a new book, Land and Liberalism, Henry George and the Irish Land War. So we have
Thanks,
congratulations, Andrew. Right in the middle of my screen, I see Catherine Shannon. So Catherine, if you would like to pose your two questions to do with women activists and Michael Davitt.
Yes, thank you, Kevin, and congratulations, Niall. I've enjoyed this discussion with you and Jody and Kevin greatly. I know that in the book that he's at North Adams, who did the book on the Irish land war and North America, Eli Janis, he had a good deal of coverage of the activity of women supporters for the Land League in Rhode Island and also in Cleveland. And I know from my own research on this period in terms of Boston, there was considerable involvement. I'm wondering if you found the same thing in the other countries that you researched, in Argentina and also in Scotland, and how the clergy in those areas reacted to women's involvement. And perhaps would you consider Michael Davitt an important influence on internationalizing this question?
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine, for your questions. So in the book, there's a chapter on the Ladies' Land League in Scotland, and particularly in Dundee, where it was very much a working class movement. So the textile mills in Dundee had a lot of Irish immigrant women working in them. And the Ladies' Land League sort of thrived there among these textile workers, jute mill workers. So it had a good response there, and in industrial towns in the north of England, I would say, more so than the south of England. But, again, following patterns of sort of industry, textile industries, and Irish women migrants there. And the book also looks a bit at Marguerite Moore, who was this Ladies' Land League organizer in Ireland and also traveled in Britain a lot. And Ladies' Land League had less of a presence in Argentina. There were more sort of relief funds organised by Irish Argentine women, but less Ladies' Land League. I mean, they sent money, but I didn't find any clear evidence that there were branches, just sort of maybe loose anecdotal evidence. There might have been one branch in Buenos Aires, but that seemed quite informal. And then your last question, Michael Davitt, I think definitely, he's a huge factor in the internationalization of the land question, and of course also significant in the formation of the Ladies' Land League. Davitt appeals to people for a lot of reasons, and he's hugely popular in Scotland, of course, obviously in Ireland and in the US as well, and has lived in all of these different places. So he's a key person in this story, but I don't emphasize him so much, I think, because other historians have done it so well, and emphasize Davitt also. He's always there in the background, so to speak, but I sort of move other figures into the foreground.
Thank you.
answer your questions.
Joe, did you want to come in on David? Any of that?
Just to say, I think this is another area where Irish historians have given such an immense contribution, because the proposal of a global reach of Henry George in a global land conversation doesn't make any sense until the relatively recent research talking about David's travels around Australia and the Pacific, and the Australian diaspora and their uptake of Irish radicalism. And Niall's contribution also adds this connection to Spanish conversations in Mexico and Latin America. The Mexican Revolution and the creation of the ejido system is, alongside the Irish Revolution, some of the great hinges of the history of economic systems and economic inequality. They are the two great revolutions that, without communism, managed to reduce colonial inequality by pioneering occupancy rights and redistributing the land. So I think Dr. Shannon is absolutely right to make those connections, and I applaud her for asking about the connections to the Ladies' Land League, which was on my list of questions, but I was running out of time. I think Niall has shown us the diversity of the Ladies' Land League in a way that really pushes the story past this aristocratic, genteel portrait of the Parnell sisters. To appreciate these, we had a tiny glimpse of those Irish American girls in Pawtucket in Elu Janis's book, sending back $1 every week to Ireland to fund the work of the Land League. And now we are asked by Niall to understand those women working in the jute factories in Dundee as intellectuals, really, as intellectuals and organizers in their own right. So it's an ennobling portrait. It's a very rich portrait of agency from below.
And just one follow up to that. I think this legacy goes certainly into the 20th century, when you see the Irish women in Lawrence getting involved in the Bread and Roses strike there. And it was very, very clear that they were taking their inspiration from their mothers and grandmothers who were active a couple of decades beforehand.
Yeah, I think definitely there's the Ladies' Land League, even in the sort of coming of man generation and the sort of revolutionary years, looked to the Ladies' Land League as this inspiring example, sort of precedent of women's activism. And of course, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and people like that also involved in Lawrence also see it as a big reference point, And Marguerite Moore, this person in the book, sort of links these things because she's still around and still active in the revolutionary years in the 1920s, and sort of is friends with Gertrude Kelly and people like that who are sort of, I guess, left-wing nationalists, you could put it that way, in the revolutionary years in the US.
Right.
So we have a complex question in chat from Brennan MacDonald, because it's about a complex thing, the new departure, and the reconfigurations that take place during this critical period of the land war. I think it's a very good question, Brennan, because for Niall's book, because we're accustomed, especially when teaching, to putting people into ideological camps. So they're constitutional nationalists, or they're physical force nationalists, or they're land reformers. Sometimes there's overlap, but in actual practice, we see that through Niall's life stories, life histories, that it's very fluid and complicated. People move for strategic reasons. People shift maybe because they don't regard inconsistency as a bad thing, the way it might be irritating to a teacher who's trying to. So, Brennan, I'll let you pose your own question, obviously, but I just wanted to preface that with my own remarks. Go ahead, please.
So yeah, just thank you, Professor. I read The Dynamiters, thoroughly enjoyed it as well, and I know that. So I know we know a lot about, on the high level, of figures in the IRB and Clan na Gael and their relationship with the Land League. But I guess, was there anything, Professor, that you found in your research to suggest that in these communities that you researched, people who might have been, Republican in their outlook, they still have that portrait of Tone or Emmett hanging up on their wall, but they're now supporting an organization that, at least in theory, is operating within the imperial system? Was there something like a new departure in how these communities viewed what best to treat Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I guess I would depart from Kevin's comments earlier in that I guess sometimes we tend to think of the new departure as this sort of unity of three very different strands of you know, political activism in Ireland. But I think the reality was people could be all three, and you could find all of three of these strands in one person. You know, attitudes changed over time according to circumstances, according to the people in particular movements. Accommodations were made according for practical reasons, sometimes ideological reasons. I wouldn't say necessarily. Well, I guess the circumstances of the land war itself, of course, are hugely traumatic. In 1879, I have to bring back all of these very emotive memories of famine and evictions, of course, linked back to these very emotive memories of famine as well. So there is that context that sort of maybe helps with this new alliance. But at the same time, I think it just maybe put expression to you know, different aspects of political attitudes that already could quite easily coexist in people at the time, you know, but that I think maybe some historians have maybe emphasized the differences, the very clear distinctions, and so maybe somewhat false distinctions between these three strands. You know, there's a lot of links in between them, if that answers your question.
So I see three more questions, and I'm going to actually group the question from Matthew Smith with the question from Ted Smith, which you'll see. So I'll go first to Enda Delaney, and then we'll bring in Matthew Smith and Ted Smith. I'm sorry, Enda, please just go ahead, Enda, and pose the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Niall, I've had the pleasure of reading your book already, so I can probably ask you a more detailed question about the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think one of the issues that certainly arose in my mind reading the book is the difference and variety of the sites of activism. And in a sense, if you know people are in Dundee, industrial Dundee, or in agricultural Argentina, it's a very different environment in which they're operating in. So I'm wondering, to what extent is the message, the nature of activism, you know, what essentially they're doing, is that shaped by that local environment? Because as you will well know, one of the criticisms of transnational history more generally, not of your book, but more generally of transnational history, is that in a sense, by taking a universal theme and looking at it, that tends to, in a sense, flatten out the complexity of local and regional contexts.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Enda, for that. That's a good question. And no, local contexts are hugely important, you know, and contribute very substantially to defining the type of activism that you then find, you know. So the Ladies' Land League is very different in Dundee than it is in London, for example, very different to the Ladies' Land League in New York. The circumstances of an Irish community in Dundee that has more women than men, you know, significantly more, twice as many women as men, shapes the type of Ladies' Land League branches that develop, their type of activism and money to send back and so on. In Argentina, again, context is hugely important, whether relating to, you know, the sort of extent of, sort of hard to understand extent of land monopoly that you get in the plains, people buying up these lands, but also in John Craig's own story. You know, he becomes an anarchist in Argentina. You know, if he migrates to England or the United States, he doesn't become an anarchist, you know, because the anarchist is this hugely strong movement in the very powerful aspect of the labor movement in Argentina. So it allows those connections and allows him to sort of embrace this more radical side of the Land League and then move on. So local contexts are hugely important, I think. And, you know, as doing transnational history, you always try your best to be as sensitive as possible towards them, but that's always, you know, I think a tricky balancing act as well for in transnational history or global history, comparative history.
So I see two questions, big questions that I think are related from Matthew Smith and then Ted Smith. And after that, we also have a question from Thomas Carty. So Perhaps Matthew and then Ted, you would just pose your question, which I take it has to do with legacies and, as Ted puts it, unfinished business. So Matthew, are you with us? Yes.
Here, thanks. And first of all, congratulations, Niall, on behalf of your colleagues at Strathclyde. It's great to see the book out, and I know it was a hell of a lot of work, especially putting it all together at a difficult time. So well done for that. And I mean, I'm nowhere, nothing like an expert on this topic, and so I'm going to ask sort of a pedestrian question. But here in Scotland, we've had quite a bit of land reform, ranging from the right to roam legislation to community buyback, and it's kind of an ongoing issue in the independence debate. And one can make the argument that some of that dates back to the legacy of the clearances, and whether that's based in myth or otherwise. That has a bearing on ongoing discussions about land reform in Scotland. And I'm just wondering, what kind of traction has the land war had in Ireland, specifically in terms of more recent debates about how land should be owned, managed, and used in Ireland? Thanks.
And perhaps we'll bring Ted straight in on that point as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. My question, yes, does bring it up to the 20th century. I grew up at home with my father talking about his cattle being run off land in Limerick by local land agitation in the 20s and 30s. And indeed, they successfully forced some of the land to be sold and taken over by the Land Commission. So to what extent was the Irish land agitation, I know it's outside the remit of your book, of post-treaty Ireland in the 20th century, unfinished business? And will the eventual publication of the Land Commission records add greatly to our understanding?
Okay, thanks, Ted and Matt. Maybe Matt, I will take yours first. So again, thanks for your comments. I wish it had more traction, I guess, is, I suppose, maybe the short answer. I think land monopoly is a big issue in Ireland again. Of course, at the core of George's critique was always a critique of monopolies, and obviously, hardly goes without saying, in Dublin, rents are increasing so rapidly, and elsewhere in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, and also in Glasgow, rents are rapidly increasing these days. So some historical sophistication is part of the debate as to how to address issues, severe issues of housing in Ireland would be very welcome, but that's not often the case. I guess we do our best to try and raise the issues of the land war and Henry George again. But my opinion would be that the government of today in Ireland would be more sympathetic towards the landlords' claims and causes rather than the claims of the Land League agitators. And of course, Leo Varadkar's the Taoiseach in Ireland mentioned that one person's rent is another person's income. We have to remember that. A statement that you wouldn't have heard in early 1880s Ireland. So I wish more, I guess, is the answer to that. Land leagues have been regenerated in some forms, but I wouldn't always take them at face value in Ireland either. Since the crash in 2008, 2009, there have been sort of groups with very different sort of political outlooks, sort of using the term land league, while not necessarily reflecting the ethos of the land war of the 1880s. Ted, your question about post-treaty Ireland, there is an aspect of unfinished business to that, I think, and I guess it is outside the remit of the book, but I guess in the work of historians of the revolutionary generation have emphasized, I'm thinking here about Gemma Clark, maybe and some other people who have worked on the Civil War, there is maybe a different dimensions to sort of violence between sort of agitators and landed estates, in that the Land League was, I guess, coordinated, organized, whereas some of the attacks on estates in the 20s and 30s seem more disorganized or an initiative taken at local level by a group of people. and maybe local jealousies over land are at play to a greater extent in the land war. I think an extent of unfinished business, but having gone through the context of the revolutionary years, those tensions between, let's say, landlords and tenants, in inverted commas, do have a different tenor to them in the 20s and 30s.
Joe, you've touched on this more than once today, but do you want to talk about ongoing significance or legacies for today?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that we get out of connecting global Irish diaspora and the ideas of Henry George is a sense of where things might have gone, So maybe the nearest approximation in real life to the ideas of Henry George is the state of Singapore, where the state takes over the administration and building of all housing as a form of infrastructure. The state replaces the landlord. So Ted, your father would have, in a Singapore type state, he could have maintained his cows and maintained a building paid for that labor by the state, and so been immune from that kind of retribution. But what Niall is touching on, and Niall is really the expert, is this, the actual history on the ground in Ireland is troubled by the legacy of terrorism, by revenge, and all of the dimensions that history has. But I'm so grateful for Ted. I wanted to put exclamation points underneath his question, in part because he's mentioning the Land Commission records. And of course, the Land Commission records are currently, I believe, in a under lock and key in a warehouse in Portlaoise. We are not allowed to get them. We can see the ones in Prony and in Belfast. But every so often there's a newspaper article about whether we'll get to see those Land Commission records. And those Land Commission records are, on the one hand, important for settling the legacy of injustice about the specificities of people who were run off their land in the 1920s and 1930s. And on the other hand, they're a fascinating potential record for the workings of the land court. There has never been a monograph on the workings of the land court in Dublin, which invented modern land reform almost out of whole cloth. So maybe there's material for future conversations at Gluckman House about those records and what is to be done to access them, or whether there's any horizon. I would certainly be intrigued.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you come out soon. Sorry, Ted, I forgot to address that part of your question. Joe very eloquently did there. Just to add, I think the Land Commission records, by adding greatly to our understanding of the land question and the land commissions in the late 19th century, also will fill gaps that the census has left. They're so rich, the information in them should be so rich and detailed, that we will learn a lot about rural Ireland and social life in Ireland in the late 19th century through them. So sooner they are made available, the better.
So Thomas Carty has been waiting to ask a question specific to the context of the peak of the land war, which has to do with famine and assisted migration, which is a huge issue in Irish landed history. So Thomas, I'll invite you to ask your question. If there's time, I will then wrap up by asking one last question of my own to both the panelists. But Thomas, go ahead if you're with us. And Thomas has been waiting a long time.
Okay.
Oh, there we are. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Niall. It was more of a comment. I was just thinking that the great question of diaspora and the focus seemed to have been getting specific to the Land League. And yet, as we know, there have been a series of famines in Ireland over the centuries. And the one we think about is An Cóta Mór, of course, but the forgotten famine was the one of 79 to 82. And it seemed to be that we have the similar kinds of issues still driving immigration, which is lack of being able to provide a livelihood. And this was addressed in part by Hacktuk's immigration scheme, that he saw clearly that people were not able to survive in some of the places that they were trying to maintain their livelihood, particularly in Mayo and parts of Connemara and parts of Donegal. And it seems to me that this is a continuing problem and a continuing part of the process of the diaspora that probably doesn't terminate for quite some time. And yet at the same time, I'm thinking that this is also removal of folks so that lands can be consolidated. And I was wondering if you were thinking of any connections between the famine issues and the land movement issues for consolidation of land and nationalization, if that makes any sense.
Thanks, Thomas. So I think the James Hack-Tuke scheme that you mentioned earlier, assisted emigration, was a relatively successful one, and I mean one of the ones that worked a little better. I think assisted emigration schemes were typically based on questions of business rather than humanitarianism. That was the case during the famine, and again later on during as you mentioned, the sort of famine conditions that emerged in 1879. They have, aside from James Hack-Tuke, have mixed results. There's an element of, as I said, with that being a business decision of consolidation of lands. But I guess the difference in 1879 is that the Land League and the Land League press are very much ready to decry any interventions like that, decisions like that, and emigration becomes something that nationalists are very much opposed to by the time of the war. There's a lot of hostility towards assisted emigration schemes and emigration generally among nationalists, even though, of course, huge resources come from immigrants to nationalist movements.
So I'll try posing this question by way of conclusion as we approach the end. Joe, I'm going to ask you too, though I haven't read your book yet. Obviously, it's about to come out. I have read Niall's, of course. And the question I have for both of you, Joe first and then Niall, is did you write the book you intended to write?
I did not. I intended to write a longue durée, data-driven history of land issues over 200 years.
Yeah.
And that's why we published the History Manifesto. I was stepping out of line as a young British historian after my first book. And I wanted to try something experimental. So I asked the senior British historian at Harvard, is this okay? And he said, well, we should write about it. So we did. But then as I got into the material, I concluded two things. One is that it's much easier to text mine 19th century Britain than 20th century anything. And that's partially about the availability of documents and the condition that the documents are in. So I've been publishing an awful lot on text mining 19th century British Parliament, but I couldn't work with the archives of the United Nations or the activist archives that I was looking at in India. So the 20th century was lost to me. And then the other thing that I discovered is that indeed, just as I had been warned, longue durée is hard. And it turned out that I could just do about 90 years of land politics. And then the manuscript was too long and there were too many issues, and all of the readers said, you just have to chop this massive book into half. So now it's a slightly less massive book of 500 pages. But this is, I think Niall and I have both in this way had this experience of chewing on really big questions that expand over space and time. And you come out with a very different feeling book. And it's an experiment in a genre. I for one, think it's worth doing.
Thank you. Niall?
Again, no is the answer for me. The book, or the project at the start, let's say before I was calling it a book, was a sort of social history of all members of the Land League in different countries. So it's sort of taken the approach that I guess I did do in one chapter in Scotland, but doing a social history of members, profiling multiple people. But in the end, I ended up writing a book about a smaller cohort of people. But so I guess maybe yes and no would be the answer to that.
Thank you, Joe Goldie, and thank you, Niall Whelehan, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you, Kevin, for organising.
you for hosting us, and thank you, Caroline and House.
And thank you, Caroline.
And thank you everyone for coming along. Great to see so many faces, digital faces in the gallery here.
In some Zoom meetings, they have the tradition of unmuting to give actual applause. I think Niall definitely deserves it. Will you join me?
Oh, you too.